Thank you, Eddie. Like the next speaker, I come from the great state of New South Wales. I had the pleasure to meet Tony over 40 years ago when we were both student politicians at the University of Sydney. The accounts of those days are recorded fairly accurately in Greg Sheridan's book, When We Were Young and Foolish. But I also knew Tony from rugby union days. We both played with Sydney University. And of course, with respect to rugby union, I had the pleasure last night of dining with Professor Neville Rocher, who is unfortunately giving his speech this afternoon at 10 minutes after the kick-off between New Zealand and Australia in Dunedin. The result of that game is not in doubt. The Wallabies are paying $13 and the All Blacks are playing $1.02. The only thing which is in doubt is which side Barnaby Joyce will run on with. And while we're on Section 44, I've known Tony for so long, and it is said that Tony was born in England. It's not true. Tony was born in Kenya, and his real name is Anthony Hussein Abbott. And so the birther movement will actually be very alive here in Australia very soon. But with respect to Tony, Tony needs no introduction. One of his greatest claims to fame was being an Oxford Blue when he was a Rhodes Scholar. When he returned to Australia, I was also involved in boxing, and I offered, before a charity match, to spar 3 rounds with Tony. And after about 15 seconds into the first round, I formed the clear and firm view that he was trying to kill me. Luckily for me, I lived that day, and I live here tonight, this afternoon, to introduce him. He's been one of my greatest friends over many years. He's a person of great intellect, courage and loyalty. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce you to Tony Abbott. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Jeff, it's wonderful to be in your company, to be in your presence. Thank you for that very warm introduction. And if I could just return the compliment, Jeff and I did play rugby together back at Sydney University all those years ago. And Jeff was probably a better sledger than he was a rugby player, as you'd expect. And I think his finest moment as a rugby player, his finest moment as a second rower came when he was being comprehensively out-jumped in the line-out. At one stage, the other side's line-out jumper went down injured. Jeff said, "I'm a doctor, you've got to take him off." It is terrific to be here with the members and supporters of the Samuel Griffith Society. It's great to be with people who appreciate and cherish our Constitution and the other traditions which have made us the country that we are. I'm honoured to be here 2 years running, and I said at the close of my presentation last year that as a nation we should focus on our strengths more than on our weaknesses. Having said that last year, and having done my best to focus on our constitutional and cultural strengths, today I do want to focus on what I think is a constitutional and cultural weakness. And that is the inability of centre-right governments to get centre-right legislation through the Parliament because of the power and the nature of the contemporary Senate. Because of this, I believe that at least when centre-right governments are in office, we have gridlock, not government, and we have governments that are in office and not in power. So what I want to do briefly this afternoon, and I understand that my friend and colleague Senator James Patterson will give what might be described as an address in reply after I've made my presentation. What I want to do is briefly outline what I think is the contemporary reality, to look at some of the reasons for this predicament and then to chart a possible way forward. Now, the biggest public policy problem that we have is the inability of government to live within its means, and yet centre-right measures to deal with this consistently fail to pass the Senate. And there is no better illustration of this than the fate of the 2014 budget. The 2014 budget proposed a range of measures, all of which were long-term structural economic reforms, and all of which would have had the impact of sustainably and substantially reducing government spending. We wanted to replace male total average weekly earnings indexation for social security benefits with the consumer price indexation, and that would have quite significantly slowed the growth of social security spending over time. We wanted to say to young people, you can't leave school and go on the dole. You've got to either be learning or earning, because the last thing we want is to set you up for an unsatisfactory life by subsidising idleness. We said that once the youngest child had left home to go to school, there should be no further access to family tax benefit Part B, certainly for middle income and upper income families. We wanted to deregulate universities because we thought that if there was one institution in our society that was surely capable of standing on its own 2 feet, charging its own fees, it was universities. And we wanted to start the process of restoring funding responsibility for public schools and public hospitals to the states. None of these measures made it through the Senate, even though all of them were essential to the budget strategy of 2014. In fact, the only significant budget measure of 2014 that made it through the Senate was the temporary deficit reduction levy. In other words, all of the savings failed. The one tax increase passed. So what we saw was a graphic illustration of a Senate that would pass centre-left measures but would not pass centre-right measures. The Turnbull government has drawn the obvious conclusion from the 2014 budget's fate that the only way to repair the budget is to increase taxes, even though this obviously impacts on economic growth. And so since the 2014 budget, we've had the superannuation tax increases, and in this year's budget we had the bank tax. And notwithstanding those tax increases, we have a situation where the return to surplus, essential if intergenerational theft is to be avoided, is still mirage-like beyond the forward estimates period. And the problem when centre-right governments introduce centre-left measures is that they invariably end up looking weak and unprincipled. That was my problem when we brought in the temporary deficit reduction levy, and regrettably it's the current government's problem with the superannuation tax and the bank tax. Now, why has the Senate become so difficult? Well, in part, it's because the Senate has always been, along with the US Senate, the world's most powerful upper house. It has, in almost all material respects, identical powers to the lower house. But there has been a very significant change in the last 30 years. Prior to 1984, there were 5 senators elected per state in a normal half-Senate election, and to get 3 senators out of 5, in other words, a majority in that state, you only needed 51% of the vote. Since 1984, there have been 6 senators per state in a half-Senate election, and to get 4 out of 6, you need 58% of the vote. And only once, in Queensland in 2004, has that been fluked. But it's not just the Senate electoral arithmetic that's changed. The Senate's culture has changed as well. Some of us are old enough to remember the so-called constitutional crisis of 1975. And the line that was peddled back then was that the Senate should be a house of review, not a house of rejection. And it's true that in those days, most people did think that the Senate should be a house of review. But since those days, there has been an extraordinary growth in the mind of Senate minorities that they have a mandate which is every bit as morally legitimate as the mandate of the government of the day. The last balance of power party that worked with the government of the day, that actually took responsibility for difficult legislation, was the Australian Democrats that worked with the Howard government to introduce the GST back in the early years of this century. And because the Democrats took responsibility for a difficult but necessary economic reform, they suffered massive internal divisions and were ultimately obliterated by the electorate. And there's been an obvious lesson taken from the fate of the Democrats by minor parties and independents. Don't take responsibility for politically difficult things. So what should we do? What should we do? We can maintain business as usual. Now, under business as usual, our polity will look less and less like the polities of the countries that we are accustomed to compare ourselves with, the United States and the United Kingdom, and more like Italy. We are unlike the United States because while their Senate is just as difficult as ours, while the President of the day has just as much difficulty getting his legislation through the Congress as our Prime Minister of the centre-right has getting legislation through the Parliament, at least the President has security of tenure, which centre-right Prime Ministers in this country don't have. And if we look at the United Kingdom, there is a degree of security of tenure provided to Conservative Prime Ministers by their electoral college system, and certainly the House of Lords can only delay legislation, it can't reject it. So our polity will be a different beast in the decades to come than that which we have assumed it to be under a business as usual scenario. Indeed, it would take a crisis and probably a Labor government in a time of crisis before we will finally tackle the debt and deficit issues that we've got. Paradoxically, under business as usual, only a centre-left government could get centre-right measures through the Parliament, because only a centre-left government could count on the support of enough other votes to get its legislation through. That's the first way of approaching things. Another way of approaching things would be to say, well, you've just got to be better and better at selling yourselves, and you've got to be readier to promise difficult measures up front before an election if you're to expect a Senate dominated by a populist crossbench to support them. Now, it's true that the Abbott government did succeed in repealing the carbon tax and the mining tax. They were clear election commitments. It's true that we did eventually succeed in persuading the then Senate to repeal the school kids bonus and the low income supplement. Again, they had been commitments that we had made at the election. We weren't able to persuade the Senate to support reduce spending on public schools and public hospitals, even though they were clear commitments that we'd made in the 2013 election campaign and been ferociously attacked for so doing. And while the Turnbull government certainly did eventually get the Australian Building and Construction Commission legislation through the Senate, it was in a somewhat watered down form. So as things stand, even if you promise difficult, contentious measures pre-election, even if you cop all the political flack for putting those forward, you can't be confident that your mandate will be respected by the Senate. Take, for instance, the government's commitment to a plebiscite on same-sex marriage. There could be few things that were clearer in last year's election campaign than the government's commitment to a plebiscite on same-sex marriage, but twice that has been refused by the Senate. A third option, we could reduce the size of the Senate. That would also require reducing the size of the House. I don't think that's realistic. The hardest thing is to try to get 5 politicians, 5 sitting members to go into, say, 4 seats. It's a recipe for political disaster. We could increase the size of the Senate so that we had 7 senators per state at a half Senate election. That would reduce the vote required to get 4 out of 7 to 50%, but I think we have enough politicians already, and I don't think many of us would support increasing the size of the Parliament. Finally, the fifth option is to reduce the powers of the Senate. Now, this is what the Howard government put forward in 2003. It was obvious at that stage that the Senate was going to be a problem with the demise of the Democrats, and so the Howard government proposed, amongst other things, back in 2003, an amendment to Section 57 such that if the Senate rejected legislation 3 months apart, it could then go to a joint sitting of both houses without the need for a double dissolution first. Now, I can imagine that, particularly in an audience such as this, the immediate reaction to such a proposal would be, well, if you reduce the power of the Senate, you give bad governments more of an opportunity to ram through bad legislation. The problem is, centre-left legislation can go through anyway, because a populist crossbench will almost always support more spending, more regulating, and more taxes on the so-called rich. So centre-left governments don't have a difficulty. It's centre-right governments that have the difficulty, and I would argue that centre-right governments and centre-right governments alone, under normal circumstances, have the will, at least, to put solutions in place. Now, again, I know that an audience such as this, quite rightly, are reluctant constitutional reformers. We should not lightly change the Constitution, which has served us so well for well over a century. And yet we shouldn't be afraid to change when it is clearly change for the better. And let's face it, our constitutional founders envisaged that from time to time the Constitution might need to be changed. Obviously they did. Had they believed that it should be set in stone forever, there would have been no Section 128 mechanism for making change possible. And if we look at our ultimate political guide and guru, Edmund Burke, the father of modern conservatism, he said that a country without the means of change is without the means of its own preservation. So we cannot be against all change. We have to be sensible about the change we support. So there's my proposal, which I put before you today, knowing that here is an audience that is both expert and, in broad terms, sympathetic. My hope is that by putting this proposition to you, there will be an element of testing, and I will be better able to gauge the wisdom and the feasibility of taking it forward. I have to say that I would be happy to fight an election with a simultaneous referendum proposal along the lines that John Howard put forward back in 2003, because it would give the people of Australia a very clear choice. Do you want government or do you want gridlock? Do you want a government that can make promises with a realistic prospect of being able to keep them, or do you want government that, with the best will in the world, will be prevented by the Parliament for doing that which it said it would do? Now, I have to say that I haven't always been a favourite of West Australian Conservatives in particular, because I wrote a book some years ago called Battle Lines, where, amongst other things, I suggested that we ought to consider looking at amending the Constitution to provide, under certain circumstances, for the Commonwealth to have the ability, in narrowly defined circumstances, to override the states. Now, I put that proposal forward because in those days, at the end of the Howard era, we had what was, by and large, a very good federal government that was being taken advantage of by a series of, by and large, very profligate state governments. The job of a Conservative is not to apply some kind of theoretical abstractions to life. The job of a Conservative is to identify the principal problems of the day and to put forward practical solutions. Today, our problem is less bad state governments, although they haven't gone away. Today our problem is a Commonwealth government that wants to do the right thing but can't, because all too often the Senate won't let it. In the end, the challenge for all of us, but particularly for Conservatives, is to solve problems. That is what distinguishes us from ideologues of the left and of the right. We are practical problem solvers. We're not pure pragmatists because we have sets of principles and values that have stood the test of time and that we passionately believe in. But in the end, it is to the solution of these problems, or for the better management of these problems, that our values and our principles should be applied. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.